Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The new JSSJ graduate-level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, equips professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources that organizations need to bridge generational gaps and ensure inclusive growth. Learn from renowned experts like Julia Watts-Belzer in her upcoming course, Disability and Jewish Social Justice. Apply for her class by May 15th. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. That's usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 428, Reading with Our Hands and Ears. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing our series of conversations about Judaism and disability with our guest, Livia Thompson, who's the executive director of JBI. JBI was originally founded as the Jewish Braille Institute, but now it's just known as JBI. JBI enables people of all ages and backgrounds who are blind, have low vision, or are print disabled to connect to and participate fully in Jewish cultural, literary, educational, religious, and communal life through increasing accessibility and inclusion by creating, publishing, and distributing Jewish interest materials in audio, Braille, and large print. So before we get into that discussion, just wanted to wish you a happy Passover. And when we think about Passover here at Judaism Unbound, we immediately think of the Omer, the 7-week period between Passover and Shavuot. And that's partly because Shavuot is Lex's favorite holiday, but mostly it's because the Omer is when we do a whole slew of 3-week Yeshiva classes. And the next round of those classes starts next week. So now is the time to sign up if you haven't already. The Yeshiva is our radically open, digitally driven center for Jewish learning and unlearning. The classes don't assume a Jewish background, and these 3-week classes are a great taste of what learning in the Yeshiva might feel like. Our teachers are Judaism Unbound staff and some of our favorite podcast guests and more listeners. So this round we have great classes on Abraham Joshua Heschel's teachings on prayer, on Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish identities, on the fool in Jewish tradition, and on fish. Not the food, the banned fish, and how the whole fish phenomenon might get us thinking about Judaism in new ways. So check out these classes and sign up at www.judaismunbound.com/classes. Go do it now. And now let's turn to today's conversation. In the first conversations in this series, we talked about the need to make Judaism, Jewish institutions, Jewish content more accessible to people with disabilities. And today we wanted to talk to someone who is actually working on that very project. So a lot of the organizations we talked to were founded in the last decade or two, but JBI was founded in 1931, and its free library service has a huge collection of books in audio, Braille, and large print editions encompassing fiction, history, biography, short stories, whatever you can think of, in English, but also in languages like Russian, Yiddish, Spanish, Hebrew, Hungarian, French, Romanian, and Polish. JBI helps students who are blind, visually impaired, or reading disabled to receive a Jewish education alongside their sighted friends and participate in communal life. Adults can access the written word for pleasure, information, and religious observance, and for lots and lots of other reasons. JBI's been around for a long time, but a lot of people don't know about it, and we're excited to share this incredible resource with folks out there. So our guest today, Livia Thompson, is the executive director of JBI. Before taking this position, she served for more than 2 decades as executive director of Central Synagogue in Manhattan, and she also has served as interim chief of staff at the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, as well as serving as a consultant with synagogues and Jewish institutions all over the world. Livia Thompson has served as president of the National Association for Temple Administration and as a representative on the Union for Reform Judaism's board. We're excited to learn about JBI's important work today, and we think you will be as well. So, Livia Thompson, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I am excited to have you for so many reasons, but the starting point is that I know that one of the things that JBI produces is audiobooks, and audiobooks are central to my life. It's really the way that, for whatever reasons, that's the way that I read. And I'm always really frustrated that there aren't enough Jewish books available as audiobooks. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what JBI does in the realm of audiobooks and obviously why it does it for people with visual impairments. But I'd just love to learn more about what the content is and how it's made.
So first of all, I just want to say that audiobooks for a lot of us is a magical way to listen to books. It's not the only way. When we start talking about the power of Braille, we need to acknowledge and understand that for a lot of individuals, Braille is the way to read, and they don't want to be told, oh, you can have an audiobook. But for JBI and for me personally, because I too am a little bit of an audiobook junkie, audiobooks is a way for us to make sure that individuals who might have difficulty otherwise accessing the printed word can hear and learn and grow and laugh and cry and become part of the Jewish community in so many different ways. One of the things that I've learned both at JBI but also as a listener is how important it is that when a book is read, it's read with a kind of passion, low-level passion. You don't want it to be too emotive, but that the person leans into the book and makes you feel as if you're part of whatever is being read. For that reason, we don't do a lot of liturgical books as audiobooks. We do a few, but it is the case that we are doing poetry. It's really beautiful to listen to. It's actually beautiful to hear recorded because during the process, you have a sense of what the author is trying to do and what the reader is trying to do in telling what the author has done.
I'm curious about how the audiobooks get made. Like, do you have requests from people where they say, I've been dying to, oh, by the way, this is one from me. Yeah, I've been dying to read Mordecai Kaplan's Judaism as a Civilization, but it's so long and I can't, I know that people aren't asking for that reason, but they're saying, I'm really, I'm visually impaired and I really want to read this book. Will you make it for me? Or is it more that whoever wants to read a book, sort of comes in and that's the books that you have available and folks are able to access what you're able to make?
We have about 14,000 books already recorded in 9 different languages, and those were picked for a variety of reasons, including some of the classics, just what you would think every library should have. So, for example, books by Philip Roth, books by Chaim Potok, books by Naomi Reagan, history of the Holocaust, history of the founding of the State of Israel, books in Yiddish by Isaac B. Singer and Shalom Aleichem. These are all things that we see as just books that if they're not otherwise available, and that's a big caveat for us, we're not going to do a book that somebody already has recorded. But if they're not being recorded, we want to make sure that all of our patrons, our clients, have access to them. We've also gotten a lot more democratic. Everyone has an opinion on what's the most important book. You just voiced your opinion, Dan.
Well, I didn't say it was the most important. I just said it's the one that I want to read.
Okay. But everyone has a book they think we should be recording. And so we do try, when it is a book that isn't otherwise available, to put that on our to-do list. We actually are anxious to get as broad a swath of books as possible. We're even starting to look at recording graphic novels, which, is a very hot form of literature, especially with younger people, and extremely complicated to record as an audiobook because of the relationship between the visual and the printed word. We have also been thinking about different kinds of literature. We're doing a lot more Jewish poetry. We are recording children's books. We are trying to record happy books because we understand that a lot of our clients are somewhat isolated and they, like the rest of us, want to curl up with a book and just enjoy. I think we had done a lot of academic books in the past, and while we're continuing to do that, we see the value in doing books that are more lighthearted.
I want to sit with what you started with, though. One of the first things you said was there's not just audiobooks, there's also people who feel really passionately about Braille. And I think for somebody who is sighted, we could look at all of these things, Braille versions of books, And just to define, I think most of our listeners probably know, but Braille being the format of reading for folks who are visually impaired that involves using their fingers and hands and feeling the letters of the words on text. And audiobooks and even large print books, we could experience those as like, oh, great. All of those are kind of one big block of forms of reading that help people who are visually impaired engage with books. But it's clearly not that simple. And there's actually, I mean, I'm a little familiar, and I'd love to hear more from you about some of the tensions that arise there. I mean, this is not related to Braille and audiobooks, but I was watching an episode of a TV show recently, like that was featuring a person who is not able to hear. And there's huge controversies about how to go about teaching ASL versus how to go about cochlear implants. And like those serve different purposes in the world. And one of them, I mean, you could orient to them in different ways, but historically, like having access to ASL, American Sign Language, and being able to create communities, it's kind of an entire culture. And going to a cochlear implant does not quite create a different subculture of people who are not able to hear or are hearing impaired. Instead, it creates a way for them to operate with those who can hear better. And so there's tensions here. And I'd love to hear, given that you're an organization that does both Braille creations and audiobooks, how do you navigate, and to what extent do you navigate those kinds of questions?
So we do have to navigate. I just want to point out that when you're reading Braille and you're feeling the Braille letters, those are raised dots that create the letters. So you're not actually feeling a letter E in.
Yes, sorry. I did not mean to suggest that. Yeah.
And with the new technology that exists, quite extraordinary technology, you can read Braille on what looks like an iPad screen that becomes a three-dimensional screen with protruding pieces of metal. I believe it's metal, might be plastic, that you can feel, and that is the Braille. So that's just what technology has brought to this field. But to go back to, we think of ourselves as Jews think of themselves. I think of myself as a person of the book, right? People of the book. That is a very visceral sense of what that means. And to many of us, it means physically being able to hold something, especially if you think about a prayer book or the Torah or commentary, that there's something so emotional about being able to physically hold it. That leads to the need for everyone who is blind and knows Braille to be able to have a physical book that they can read, and that they can have the same connection as a person of the book that I have when I read my own prayer book. What's complicated about that is that it's about a 1-to-3 ratio. So one page in a standard Siddur prayer book would be about 3, maybe 4 pages in Braille, and those pages are probably going to be larger. Books become very heavy. It can be 12 to 14 volumes of Braille for a single prayer book that you might pick up from the back of the seat in front of you at services. So we're always having to think about the physical nature of Braille at the same time as we're trying to make sure that people can access that sense of the physical nature of a book. And just like many readers, you want to be able to flip back and forth, and Braille allows you to do that in a way that an audiobook perhaps doesn't. The other thing that we think about is that I never want to be in a position, nor do I think any of us want to be in a position of ever saying to someone, this is the format you have to read this book in, because this is good enough, right? And if you talk to the leaders of 2 of the national Braille organizations, ACB, the American Council of the Blind, and NFB, the National Federation of the Blind, their members will tell you they want to do it the way they want to do it. Who are we to suggest otherwise? So Braille, we are doing more Braille than we were doing for a while. Braille children's books, Braille adult books. We are doing secular and liturgical because we feel that it's so important for us to show respect for that component of reading. And Rabbi Lauren Tuckman, who I understand you've spoken with, has been very helpful in our work with liturgical books. Our audiobooks are largely done by volunteers, and these are volunteers who pass a test, quality test of their voice, their capacity, not to be an actor, but to make somebody feel that they are in the book. There are a few books I've read where I felt that way, but really, when Eleanor Roosevelt spent about a month and a half on my shoulder while I was reading a 3-part biography of hers, she wasn't reading the book actually, but I felt like she was in my head the entire time. And that's what we want from our readers.
So I want to draw a little bit of a parallel. There are really loud shouting matches in Jewish education spaces about whether we should be translating, and especially whether we should be transliterating, which is to say rendering Hebrew into its phonetic English, whether we should have that at all in prayer books. If you go to different, and in other kinds of books, if you go to different prayer books, some of them ideologically, this is not just like a practical thing, they do not put the transliteration. And the reason for that is that there's a few reasons for that. I personally don't like those reasons, putting my cards on the table. But the reasons for that are that the people creating those prayer books, they don't want to make it too easy to engage in the Hebrew without actually knowing the Hebrew. They want to incentivize people to actually learn how to read Hebrew. And there's something, I don't want to say that that's like evil, that there's something noble about that. There's something valuable. I love the Hebrew language. And end of the day, the vast majority of Jews in the country that we're all in right now, in the United States, really in every Jewish community that is not in Israel, the vast majority of those people can't speak Hebrew. For me, I always end up advocating to have both translation and transliteration in every Jewish text. And I have a rule for myself that whenever I create like a handout or something for a text study I'm facilitating, that I always have all of those. With Braille and audiobooks are the thing that would serve there are a huge number of people, a much bigger number of people that are able today to engage with an audiobook than are able to engage with Braille. And if I were using the same argument I was just using before, I would say that's kind of an argument to prioritize audiobooks. But I really really value and cherish Braille, because I don't want to create a world where Braille is no longer learned and where people can't have that tactile response relationship to a book that you described. And so I find myself pushing back and forth. There's big questions that your organization brings to light about how we go about accessibility in Jewish life. So what are some of those tensions?
It's a little complicated because it's based on what rights we have based on a federal law. Basically, we are entitled, without violating copyright, to make copies in Braille, large print, and audio if they're not otherwise available, because the federal government says everyone should have access to books and articles and materials that are printed. And if they're not going to be made available by the publisher, you, JBI, and others have the right to do it. So we take the and approach to all of this, which is, again, we don't want to determine what is the best way for someone to engage with any text. So we want to provide it in multiple formats if we are entitled to do so. With liturgical books, we have erred on the side of large print and Braille only because so many people are not going to listen. I might take PJ Family Haggadah and put that in as an audiobook, and we have, because it's a learning opportunity. But the Chabad Haggadah, which we also provide, which is the book used at Seder, we don't turn that into an audiobook because nobody's going to listen to it as an audiobook. But if I have a children's book and I can put it into Braille and I can put it into large print and I can put it into audio, then I am providing all of the different ways that somebody might choose to access the book or might choose to be with somebody together where one of them was going to access it one way and somebody else the other way. It's an interesting problem more when you think about when is it not appropriate to just listen to something, or when is it required that you actually are reading from the sacred text, the Torah. What does it mean? And there has been a lot of debate about how children who are blind can become bar or bat mitzvah if they are not physically reading from a scroll that most of us would consider the sort of kosher scroll of our own synagogues. There is a scroll which has been developed by a rabbi named Lenny Zarko. There's debate on whether or not it is a scroll that meets the halachic, the legal Jewish requirements as a religious text. We don't take an opinion on that. We don't need to. What we say to people, if they ask us, if they want to get in touch with him, we'll provide that information happily. If they want us to braille the Torah portion for them that they're going to chant, we will happily do that. Every way that we can create a barrier-free Judaism, we want to create it. And that means any format. So I see it a little bit less of a tension, and I certainly understand the transliteration argument as I see it as an opportunity. Let's provide all of them. Let's say to anyone who wants to learn more, engage more, sure, how can we help and how quickly?
So I have two small questions and one big question. The small questions are, number one, that Braille Torah that you're talking about, the Torah scroll, is it 3 times as long?
You know, it's funny. So I actually saw the Torah at the ACB, or the American Conference of the Blind conference last summer. And I realized after I walked away from it that it didn't look particularly big. What I think was the case was I only saw one scroll and that it's actually multiple scrolls, but I'm not sure. We don't have a copy. That's not what we're doing. We have other copies of the Torah as books in Braille and large print, but we understand what it is he's trying to do.
My other small question, and it's not really a small question, but it's really just a point of information. And I ask this partly for selfish reasons, but partly also because we've been talking over the course of the podcast in all kinds of ways. We've talked about universal design as a notion, but also as a metaphor for saying if we can make Judaism more accessible to a certain person, then actually it'll become more accessible to other people as well. So the classic example in disability law, which is my background, is like if you make curb cuts in the sidewalk for people who are in wheelchairs, then that's actually turns out it's going to help people who have babies because they're going to be able to push the stroller. And I was thinking, like, in a world where we are making audiobooks primarily for people who are blind, potentially that makes there be these Jewish audiobooks available for people that are not blind. And actually in Israel, when I download audiobooks in Hebrew from the Israeli audiobook site, they often start, like you hear when they start, they say this book was recorded in the version of the Israel's JBI. I forget what it's called exactly.
Yeah, National Library for the Blind.
So I'm wondering whether the books that you record are available to people that are not blind, or are they not available? It's not possible. It's not legal. Curious about that.
Yeah. And I want to go back to Braille, if I could first, before I answer that question, because one of the things that's so fascinating when you think of accessibility and you think of trying to make everything as open as possible, is you would think there would only be one form of Hebrew Braille, but there isn't. There are actually 2 forms.
Sounds very Jewish.
Yeah, it's very Jewish. Is
the Hebrew Braille I use and the Hebrew Braille I wouldn't set foot in.
Exactly. It's more the Hebrew Braille that was established by Israel and the Hebrew Braille that was established in part with the support of JBI starting in the 1930s. And they're slightly different. They are both left to right, just like English Braille, which is a little bit different from the Hebrew that you or I may read.
Why is that? Do you know?
I will tell you it makes it easier to produce a document, but I don't know that that had anything to do with it. And of course, when it was first designed, it was pre-computer. So some of the issues that we now have that make it so much easier that it's all left to right were not issues that they would have dealt with initially. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, nothing is quite as easy as you would like it to be. So our particular restriction for all that we do is it has to be only for people who are blind, visually impaired, or print disabled. So if you have dyslexia, if you have Parkinson's, if you can't physically hold a book, you are what's called print disabled, and we're happy to provide you with materials. That definition is quite broad. The federal government, which again provides us with the restrictions, and allows us to use the Postal Service at no cost. So we are grateful. That is a restriction which protects the copyright status of books that otherwise I could take and record and then sell cheaply on the internet. I can't do that. So what I do is we record the books, we encrypt the books, and they're only readable by people who have access to that encryption code. We now can send Braille in a digital format, which is then downloaded into an e-reader, which creates a three-dimensional screen. With large print, we physically send that to people unless it's something that is in the public domain or we have the right to do it as a file. So there is a limitation, which again is partly why our goal is to increase the world of books that are accessible and available. If Audible Books or SharePoint or Safaria or the National Library System in the United States, which serves individuals who meet the same criteria, or the National Library of the Blind in Israel with whom we work, if they already have it, we're not going to do it. Our lane, it's a very deep lane, believe me, there are more than enough books in this world that aren't getting recorded by anyone that we can take on and make available. The other thing I would say is that we see ourselves as also a place, anyone who is blind or print disabled or low vision can come and use our materials. And so there are a lot of those books that aren't currently accessible, and we're working on that.
That's really, really cool. And so, by the way, folks, head to the show notes for this episode. We'll have links to the JBI website and ways that you can learn more about a lot of these different components of their work. With Lauren Tuckman a few weeks ago, I put out there a little bit of a pun. I was thinking about the word Braille. I think in puns. It's just the way that my brain works. And sometimes it's between different languages where they aren't technically supposed to be operating. Braille. I Googled, I was curious, how you spell Braille in Hebrew, not in Hebrew Braille, but how you would spell it phonetically. And It didn't quite square with the pun I want to make. The Torah begins with 3 Hebrew words. First one, Breshit, which that's in the beginning or in the beginning of, we could go on a whole long thing about that, but roughly in the beginning. And then Bara Elohim, Bara El, Braille. It's right there. First sentence. I know it's not the precise pronunciation, but I think it's cool that, so the meaning of those words, bara, it's created or create. And El is one of the names of God. And so if we were to hear Braille as God creation, godly creativity, you could translate it a number of ways. I think that's kind of a cool idea. And I think it reflects reality. I think there is a way in which to achieve the power of transmitting words that have been understood in most civilizations as things you see on paper or on tablets or whatever, or even as things that you hear, but not so much as things that you feel tangibly. To make that shift and transmit language into something you feel on paper, there's an amazingness to it that is like so, I don't know, it feels just like true to me that that's mystically incredible. It's just like, wow. And so I want to find these like fun little puns that imply sacredness.
Yeah.
But like, I'm curious, can you talk to us a little more about just, I'm even imagining with that scroll, right? Like when I get to certain parts of the Torah, there's little interesting things that happen with Hebrew letters sometimes. I don't know if you know what Braille does with this, but there's a famous letter in the book of Numbers where the Vav, the letter Vav, is broken. And so it's like not a full letter. There's like a break in the text of the letter.
Yeah.
And so I'm imagining, I don't know what Braille does with that, but I'm assuming something interesting. And I'm imagining feeling that. And there's something about that that is just a level deeper than seeing it on a page. It's like, wow, my fingers are actually taking in the brokenness of this letter. And so that's one example. I'm sure there's many others, but like, I'm curious if you can talk to us a little more just about like, what's some of the magic of Braille?
I do have to give a little bit of a shout out to Louis Braille, who gets some credit for the fact that we call Braille Braille. I did get the opportunity to visit his grave in Paris when I was there last year. And I have to say, I found it very emotional to be there, just given the fact that he did help to create a way for people to get to the printed word who might not otherwise have gotten there. So just whether it's from Bereshit or it's from Louis Braille, it's a miracle either way. And I definitely feel that. The other thing I would say, and your comments kind of go to this, but we think of our mission as narrow and very deep and very personal, kind of an imperative. And that imperative means we're not looking at whether or not there are 100,000 people who want to read the text that we're creating in Braille. That's not the question we ask. The question that we ask is there somebody who wants this? Is there somebody who is going to be able to read this thing if we put it in Braille who wouldn't otherwise have been able to do it? That profound kind of connection between the ability to create something in this format and serving anyone for whom this is the format that they want. While we count numbers, we have to show our donors that we are doing our best in meeting the most number of people. When I'm creating a prayer book, when we're thinking about our Braille materials, is this something that should be accessible? And if it should be, we should do it. So that is very in keeping, I think, with that magic and that sense of providing an openness to the world that I think is so important. And lastly, it's not just Braille now for individuals who are blind or really low vision. It's this whole world of visual depiction and visual illustrations, all of the ways that we need to make sure that we are not making assumptions about people's capacity to read. You can go to architecture school now if you are blind, because there are programs that allow you to create a three-dimensional drawing that allows somebody who might not have been able to go to school to become an architect to do so. And I think that's another generation of magic that is being created. We're involved in that in just a little way, and we're thinking about what else should we be doing to make everything Jewish fully available. And that may involve thinking about some of these other things other than Braille, but it's all connected, right? It's all about that idea of touching and reading, touching and learning. I don't know about you, but when I grew up, my mother often said, don't touch. Different approach.
Livia, can you tell us a little bit about the history of JBI, like when it got started, how that happened? And I'm also curious about how does it continue to exist? In other words, like how much staff is there? Is there a lot of, is it expensive? Do you have donors? Where do you get the money to do this kind of work? Because I would imagine it's pretty expensive to create a Braille book because one person wants it.
Yeah. So our founding story is a wonderful story that, of course, has to do with New York City. It has to do with the Bronx, unfortunately, not Brooklyn.
Love to anybody in the Bronx who's listening.
Love.
We love the Bronx. We love Brooklyn.
Yeah. So in the late 1920s, a young man who had come back from the war, World War I, blind, and a young boy who had come to the United States as a blind immigrant with a rabbinic father started to talk and think about how to get access to Jewish materials at a time when there was nothing that if you were blind, you could access. They, along with a businessman also from the Bronx, connected with the National Sisterhood of Temples, which was an organization of the Reform movement, and convinced them to start to support this not yet organization. They had volunteers from synagogues all across the country for decades who learned to type Braille. Then they learned to record when recording became more popular. And they would send in discs and books to what became JBI. And we have materials from sisterhoods all over the country. It's really quite wonderful. They also provided us initially with financial support. Over time, that financial support waned, the volunteers waned, but by then, JBI luckily had gotten enough of its own sea legs so that it was able to continue. We now rely heavily on individuals and on foundations, no city, state, or federal government money, because we are focused on Jewish materials, Jewish texts, and over 70 volunteers. And I'll just say for anyone who's listening, whether you're from the Bronx or Brooklyn or Manhattan, Queens or Staten Island, or one of those nearby locations, we're always looking for volunteers, and we are more and more able to work with volunteers remotely who are interested in recording books for us. But yes, we are small and mighty. We are 24 staff, one building. We do all of our production and distribution from the building. When we give a tour and take someone through the building and they see what we can accomplish on a few floors with a few very, very dedicated staff, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm flashing back to that moment where you described the amazing gift that is the scroll or the multiple scrolls, whichever it might be, of a Torah scroll being transmitted through that process into Braille. I celebrate and love that. And you mentioned in the course of that you were talking that there are people for whom the question, can somebody become bar bat mitzvah, if they're not reading directly from the text of a traditional Torah scroll? Like, that question is a live, real question. I feel the need to say directly that I am infuriated and sad that anybody would ever consider that some 12 or 13-year-old or adult bar mitzvah, whoever we're talking about, would somehow not be able to have that ritual because they are not able to engage with our most normative version of a Torah scroll. It actually pulls at my body. I feel a visceral outrage in me right now. It makes me so mad. I can't imagine. And look, I understand there are different notions of Judaism and there are different relationships to what's happening when we read Torah, but the idea that you would look a 12-year-old and their family in the face and say, unfortunately, Jewish tradition as it is does not have space for you to do this. Sorry. To some extent, and I'm thrilled that there's now this other way that if they had access to this particular scroll that somebody put tons and tons of effort into, that now there might be a way for them to do that. But I want to ask the bigger question or say the bigger statement, which is that for me, the basic premise, if we're talking about bar mitzvah or any other Jewish ritual, is Every Jew has the right to that ritual. There is no circumstance where anybody should be told they can't have a bar mitzvah because there is some structural barrier in place. The question we should always, every time, be asking is, okay, given that you automatically, definitely have the right to a bar mitzvah in your life, what can we vision as a Jewish world that would be your authentic, amazing, meaningful bar mitzvah? Is it reading from a Braille Sefer Torah? Are we going to invest the resources either to commission one or find a way to have access to that one that already exists, whatever it might be? That's one set of possibilities. The other is, what if that kid's idea of an amazing bar mitzvah is something that would not involve them reading from a scroll in that traditional way? I think there's also a role for that, and we should be saying, okay, we're going to vision other beautiful forms of bar mitzvah. The funny thing about bar mitzvah historically is that there's basically no legal basis for the idea that somebody must read from a scroll in order to become bar mitzvah. And so we actually we have the opportunity to use that language that you've been using and that I love. We have the opportunity to use this to spur creativity. There's two sides of this, and it's a both and again. I'm not saying we don't need the amazing Hebrew Braille Torah scrolls of the world, but I'm also curious if there's ways in which your organization helps communities or helps people think about what it is to revision our Jewish inheritance in ways where all people, including those who are blind, are able to have full participation.
As somebody who didn't read from the Torah until I was 55 plus, those opportunities and rituals to engage in some of our most sacred traditions, however we do it, are so powerful. And I agree that we want to make them as available as possible in every way. And what we do is not necessarily work with the clergy of a particular congregation or anyone in that particular congregation to help them think through a different way of doing things, except to the extent that what we're saying is anything that we can help you create a different accessible format for, that's what we want to be able to do. So we have an accessibility consulting service where we work with institutions and provide them with materials that allow somebody who wouldn't otherwise have access to have access. We send out over 2,500 Haggadahs in multiple formats. And what we hear from people is, because I had the Braille Haggadah or the large print Haggadah, I was able to be a full participant at the table with my family. And I hadn't been able to do that in whatever number of years. Whether you're doing it at home, you're doing it in a religious institution, whether you're doing it in a secular or religious context, the idea that you can be completely part of the community is our goal. We are constantly trying to find ways, whether it's technology or just old-fashioned creation of these materials in multiple formats, which say to anyone, both individually and institutionally, hey, everyone can access this. And it's our collective obligation to make sure that, whether it's in our own homes or elsewhere, that we are thinking about that and not assuming that somebody shouldn't, can't, won't have access, but always assume they should, they can, and they will.
So I'm glad you mentioned large print Haggadahs. We've had some really great threads today about Braille and about audiobooks. The work you do to create large print resources is also really, really crucial. I will say, from personal experience, I don't know whether JBI was involved with this or not, but the high holiday services that I led this past year, it was on a college campus, and one of the college students was visually impaired, and he used, for his own prayer experience, the large print Reform High Holiday prayer book. And also, he actually was really excited to chant Torah. What he did is he wrote for himself his own large print piece of paper that he brought up, and he did a great job. But the large print resources are super important. And I say that because sometimes those of us who don't have visual impairment, we have a tendency to see it in terms of a binary of you're either blind or you're you have full-fledged vision.
Yeah.
Obviously, even those of us that are sighted to most degrees, like people wear glasses, we know that it's a spectrum. We know that it's not a full binary, but we still, I think, kind of think of it that way. But large print resources serve a huge, huge population of people who may not be visually impaired to the degree that they can't see at all, but are visually impaired to a degree where they're not going to be able to engage with classic size text in prayer books or otherwise. And so I'd love to just hear about that side of your work, and more broadly, why we shouldn't fool ourselves in thinking this is just serving some small population. Because look, even people that are by most definitions not visually impaired, some of them like the large font resources, and that serves them as well.
So first of all, we all understand, or maybe we don't all understand, but it is the case that we are aging. We are an aging population, and we are also living longer. And while we live longer, our bodies don't necessarily live, every aspect of them live as well as some aspects. And our eyes are delicate. And so the number of individuals in this country with visual impairment, which will not be medically curable, is supposed to double in the next 25, 30 years. And that's because our eyes are not able to keep up the degree of clarity that they had when we were younger. And I speak as somebody who is aging and whose eyes are definitely tired all the time. And so the need for large print is going to increase dramatically over the next period of time. That includes people who are interested in Jewish materials. There are significant portions of the Jewish community that will need large print. One of the things that we are working on is, how do you define large print? How do you make sure that something is large enough? And it was for a while that printers looked at 16 point or 18 point. If you think about it, most of us, when we type, we're using 12 point, just for reference, 16 or 18 point as being large print. That is not really very large, and not necessarily large enough for the majority of individuals about whom we're speaking. And so we are trying to increase what we consider our standard large print, so that we can better serve individuals who are starting to struggle with their vision. And because of technology, we can start to really create materials at within reason, any point size that will serve the individual who needs them. So our standard is now going to be 22 point, which is bigger than we had been doing. But if somebody needed a 40 point text, we could do that. Lots of computers now have the capacity to very easily take a file and enlarge it for reading on the screen or reading in your Kindle, whatever it is. But if you want, again, for the people who want the book, we need to be able to provide that in a size that will allow access. It is a growth area. In talking to our colleagues, there is a Catholic version of JBI called Xavier Society for the Blind. There's actually a Protestant version called Lutheran Braille Workers, where we all talk together and try to learn from each other. And they too are seeing this need to create more and more large print materials. So yes, very important, and only going to become more so.
I think we could say the same for this conversation. Incredibly important and only going to become more so. Thank you so much, Livia, for joining us. This has been fantastic.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us. I say us because I mean JBI.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. Also, before I get to all sorts of little announcements and closeouts, go to jbilibrary.org. That's the website of JBI. You can learn all about their different resources. If you are visually impaired yourself, it's a place that you can access books, resources of all sorts. So definitely head to their website, jbilibrary.org. Also, we hope that you'll head to our website, judaismunbound.com, but specifically our judaismunbound.com/classes page, because in just a few days, as this episode is released, and maybe if you're listening a few days after it's released, literally now, we have new 3-week mini courses starting in the Yeshiva. And there are 4 possibilities. There's Prayer as Home for the Soul, Abraham Joshua Heschel's teachings on prayer. That's with Avra Shapiro. There's The Sacred Schmuck, Uncovering Your Inner Jewish Fool, with Danielle Levsky. There's A Song I Heard the Ocean Sing, Judaism and Fish, PHISH, that's the band. And that's with Jesse Dressen. And Sephardic and Mizrahi Identities, Beyond Ashkenormativity, with Hadar Cohen. So we hope that you'll sign up for those, judaismunbound.com/classes, because I'm really a broken record and love giving links as many times as I can. That's the place to go. Last things, we hope that you will be in touch with us. You can be in touch via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. All of our handles are at Judaism Unbound. You can check out the show notes for this episode to learn more about JBI. You can also see show notes for recent episodes that were part of this disability unit, all sorts of good stuff on our website. And before we go, support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.